Number 10. Cleisthenes, Greece. Now, while conceptualizing this video, I thought a lot about what little global history I was taught in my country's average world history curriculum, so I had sat back to ancient Greece. I really did love the aesthetics of Athens. I mean, the people seem to be smart, I think, at least. Look, I'm not one of those guys you see online with a Greek philosopher statue as their profile picture, talking about how some most likely racist garbage that they spew. I just like democracy. Simple as. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time, remarked Sir Winston Churchill. Cleisthenes invented, or at least laid out the groundwork for, ancient Athenian democracy, and that's why he's on this list. I know democracy around this time wasn't really perfect, especially considering it was just a bunch of rich white guys who could vote, but for the time, this was revolutionary. Democracy, in and of itself, is an important historical invention. I knew it was invented in Greece, so I thought to myself to guarantee a spot on this list for whichever of the hundreds of philosophers with similar sounding names invented it. So, here's Cleisthenes. Number 9. Seretse, Botswana. Africa is often rarely depicted or even neglected when it comes to world history. I'm not knowledgeable on a lot about Africa, or do I claim to be, but I do know of one story though, the story of Botswana. Botswana had a very unique colonial history, with it gathering a special envoy of the most influential tribal chiefs, sending them to London to negotiate protectorate status. Still, while relations with the Botswana, dubbed Bechuanaland Protectorate, were fairly warm in proportion to its surrounding neighbors, also colonized by the British, that didn't necessarily ensure economic growth. By the time of Botswana's independence, they were the third poorest country on earth, with the selections of seretse, khama, concluded by professional historians to be completely democratic, that all changed. Seretse, khama supercharged the Botswanan economy, turning it from the third poorest country to the fastest growing economy for 40 years straight. Even posthumously, Botswana is still a well put together country in the southern flank of an often less fortunate continent. Number 8. Sejong the Great, Korea. If you're asked by a random stranger on the street what the easiest writing system in the world was, you'd probably shrug and answer Latin. Well, what if I told you that this was the single easiest writing system? Hangul. Sejong the Great, king of the Joseon dynasty of Korea from 1418 to 1450, single-handedly created the writing system, basing it off mouth movements. Hangul revolutionized Korean culture, which at the time was heavily steeped in its loyalty to the Chinese. Without Hangul, Korea would simply not feel the same, and it's likely that the nationalist fervor that turned the peninsula and its people into what it is today would be diminished. Hell, Hangul is often created with the survival of the Korean language at the time, which was being persecuted under Japanese occupation, and it managed to do that with its sheer simplicity, being, quote, learned in a few hours by a clever person and learned in 10 days by an idiot. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but what else did Sejong the Great do other than create the very foundation of modern Korean culture, you may ask? Well, he was a great economist, he reformed the military into one of Asia's most powerful armies, he gave ordinary citizens welfare, he invested heavily in scientific advances and the arts, and he was all around a great leader. Number 7. Michael Collins, Ireland. Let's go to a more personal point of view. If I asked you to name what country and set of circumstances really got you into thinking of world history rather than your native country's history, what would you say? You'd proclaim Japan, France, Italy, maybe China. I'd say Ireland. Yup, Ireland. The Emerald Isle was the first country to make me genuinely interested in other nations' histories. I was really into Irish history, and to this day, if somebody asked me what my favorite country in Europe is, I'd say Ireland. Don't judge. Though I wouldn't be touching the Civil War with a 10-foot pole out of fear of, well, the Irish. The Irish War of Independence is in my mind still courageous. Michael Collins may not necessarily be the greatest military mind out there, but he was amazing, especially considering the cards he was dealt during the revolution. Other reasons I like Michael Collins: he was a strong supporter of Irish culture, largely influential in the use of the still endangered language. Also, I'd always be a supporter of the Irish's strong Catholic solemnity. Give us the future. We've had enough of your past. Number 6. Manuel, Quezon, Philippines. I have a confession. I'm coming out of the closet, guys. I'm Filipino. Please like and subscribe so you can find a cure. Seeing as I'm Filipino and I'm in history, well, do the math. There was obviously going to be a Filipino figure somewhere here in this list. And who better than Manuel Quezon? The Philippines is one of two countries I had a lot of difficulties in while writing simply because of how many figures I considered for this list. But I installed a limit of one person per country. In the end, I went with Manuel Quezon. Though honorable mentions go to Jose Rizal, Manuel Magsaysay, Jose W. Docno, Fidel V. Ramos, hell, even Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. I have always considered Quezon to be the greatest Philippine president though. For a presidency entangled in World War II, Quezon's greatest achievement was domestic policy, the creation of the Filipino language. He united so many different peoples with a lingua franca, though some may argue that it's just Tagalog light. Other reasons as to why Quezon was so good? Well, he was an excellent statesman, great in diplomacy, he really fired up the Filipino wartime spirit, and an interesting story about him, he single-handedly saved 1,200 Jews fleeing from wartime Europe at a time where the American government forbade the Philippine colonial government from doing more to act. My loyalty to my party ends where my loyalty to my country begins. Number 5. Emperor Meiji, Japan. Possibly rounding off the controversial pick of this list, Emperor Meiji of Japan fills my number 5 spot because he's the figurehead of quite possibly my favorite event in history, the Meiji Restoration. In my mind, it was a great step in Japanese history, seeing as it had turned Japan, an isolated country barred from most of the rest of the world, to literally on par with European countries. There was a time where 1800s Japan produced more industry than Italy, and Japan had a stronger military than Russia. That was huge for the 1800s. Here's reasons why Meiji is a fair bit controversial though, and why he's only number 5 on my list despite representing my favorite period in history. First off, the big Korea-sized elephant in the room. Yes, Meiji's strength was that he was a great Japanese emperor. His fault was that he was a great Japanese emperor. The first Sino-Japanese War may be celebrated by the Japanese, but this is literally the same war that led us to some future atrocities committed by Japan, not just in wartime, but for a long time during peace in colonies, like, well, Korea. I make that distinction as Meiji was still emperor while that was happening. Second, he wasn't even a bloody broke behind the revolution. He was 14. It was mostly his cabinet. Number 4. Napoleon Bonaparte, France. France, a country that everybody pretends to like, but in actuality we barely know anything about it. That's me. I don't know a lot about France, but I do like guns and black powder on Roblox, so I'm sort of an expert on this stuff, alright? Napoleon, I mean, what's there to say? He's probably the second most famous person on this list, and, well, for good reason. He was an excellent military mind. He was 24 at Toulon, 26 in Italy, and 34 at Coronation. He is, to this day, well respected in France, and when he was still alive, he was worshipped. Quite unironically, yes, he was worshipped. He was probably the most beloved Frenchman. Well, to the French. Everybody else hated him, right? Nope. He was fairly respected as a worthy opponent, though nobody did like the whole getting invaded part of cordiality though. Peacetime achievements? Well, he laid out the groundworks for many of what the modern French government does, famously creating the Napoleonic Code. He's the highest ranking wartime figure on this list, because he was the one most worthy of it. Although, there will be 3 people above him, all active through means of peace. Number 3. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore. Possibly proving to be on the controversial end of greatest historical figures alongside Bonaparte, Collins, and Meiji, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore earns bronze on this list for many of the dear things I praise seretse khama for. In Lee Kuan Yew's own words, Singapore used to be a mudflat, a swamp. During his premiership in the 70s, it was a city. He promised that in 1972, 10 years later in 1982, that Singapore would be a metropolis. He severely understated that. Today, Singapore is my favorite Southeast Asian country, barring my homeland of course. Many will balk, sneer at this choice. And you know what? Yes, it's fair to criticize Lee Kuan Yew for his fairly authoritarian status, but me personally, I think that's actually a bit of what I like about him. Lee Kuan Yew is an inspiration to those uninformed. To those who are informed, he's a Machiavellian player of realpolitik. Quite possibly the single greatest political mind to grace the subcontinent. There's a certain drama about him. The entire country of Singapore loves this man, so much so that it's sort of become an automatic intellectual take to be a contrarian, but I won't entangle myself in another country's politics, so let's wrap this up. As Lee Kuan Yew once said, a nation is great not by its size alone, it is the will, the cohesion, the stamina, the discipline of its people, and the quality of their leaders. And without further ado, let's get to our finalists. Number 2. Robert F. Kennedy, the United States of America. Remember when I said in the Quezon entry that the Philippines was only one of 2 countries I genuinely had outstanding trouble getting an entry for? Well, the other country was the United States of America. Here though, in the United States, I already had a guaranteed spot for who I was going to be putting in here. But still, there were so many interesting figures that I liked that I'll mention really quickly in a montage of sorts. Bill Clinton, John F. Kennedy, West Barrow, Sequoia, Barack Obama, Steve Jobs, Kamehameha I of Hawaii, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and chess player Bobby Fischer, whom I had considered also putting on this list represented under the banner of Iceland, were all considered for this list, but I settled on who my role model is, the person I look up to, Robert F. Kennedy. I like Robert F. Kennedy so much. You may say, well, he didn't really do a lot. But that's what I think draws me so much to Robert F. Kennedy, to the point where I literally have this entire channel's branding based off his image. It's just that, his image. When I think of Bobby Kennedy, I don't think of him just as a person. I think of him as a set of ideas. When I think of Bobby Kennedy, one word pops into my mind: compassion. RFK fought for civil rights. He fought for those less privileged. He fought apartheid. He fought corruption. He fought for the poor. And that just stuck with me. This image of a young man born into privilege with a handsome skull going out of his way to help people out of his own volition, that's powerful. And it's genuinely changed so much in terms of how I think of the world we have. When we celebrate Bobby Kennedy, we as humans just get a bit closer together. As he said, each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. Number 1, Jesus Christ, Israel, Palestine. I'm Catholic.
君となんだって話したいな